Welcome, everybody. Greetings from Swissnex San Francisco at Pier 17. I'm Mary Ellen Johnson, and I'm thrilled today to bring artists Annie Aries, Brian House, and Marcel Zaes, together with curator Susanna Boyle, to discuss Metric Displacement. Metric Displacement is a sound installation originating from 3 distinct physical locations: Bern, Switzerland, Providence, Rhode Island, and Portland, Oregon, and where each site produces its own unique beats using Zoom as a rhythmic instrument. Metric Displacement is a project from the Swissnex Artist Call Beyond 2020, a post-pandemic practice, in which we invited artists to reflect on how the pandemic has changed our world, shaped and transformed by digital tools, and how we now collaborate and find meaning during times of physical isolation. Today's program is presented in partnership with Gray Area Foundation for the Arts here in San Francisco, as well as Brown University, Lewis and Clark College, and Bern University of the Arts. I'm now going to introduce our speakers and our moderator. Please note that at any time during the discussion, you may enter your questions in the Q&A function, and we'll address them at about 12:40 when we turn to the Q&A. And then we'll launch the installation at the close of our talk today. The first artist is Annie Aries. She's a composer and musician based in Bern, Switzerland. Annie explores, performs, and composes music and opens up sonic spaces between electronica and experimental sounds. In her works, she creates minimalistic sound textures and recurring rhythmic patterns that organically interweave, distance, and disappear. With her bands Marcel Zaes, Volca Massacre Orchestra, and Berg and Berg, she regularly tours in Europe. Brian House, our second artist, is an artist who investigates the politics of time in human and non-human systems. Incorporating sound, computation, and multidisciplinary research, his practice has transverse subjects from geolocation infrastructure to urban rats. House is assistant professor of arts and studio head of digital media at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. Marcel Zaes is a Swiss artist and artistic researcher working in sound, who is currently based in Providence, Rhode Island, where he's pursuing his PhD in music and multimedia composition at Brown University. Marcel investigates mechanical time with an interdisciplinary framework. His creative practice consists of assemblages of self-made software code that act as mechanical timekeepers and human performers who they play against, thereby creating an effective potential to rethink the gap between what is conceived of as human versus mechanical temporality. And finally, our moderator today is Susanna Boyle. Susanna is a curator and concert organizer based in Boston. She's the director of Non-Event, a group devoted to the presentation of experimental music and sound performance in non-traditional spaces. Thank you all, welcome, and I hand it over to you, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen, and thank you so much to Swissnex San Francisco for hosting not only Metric Displacement, but also this talk here today. And I also really want to thank all 3 of the artists, Annie, Marcel, and Brian, for inviting me to moderate today's discussion. In part for the very selfish reason that it's given me an excuse to spend a good deal of time with the installation itself over the last couple of days, periodically, of course, as they've been preparing it for the launch this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are here in the world. It's interesting in this day and age to be thinking much more globally, even as we are all in states of isolation. So as we prepared for today's talk, when we met beforehand, the 4 of us realized that you in the audience were at a distinct disadvantage, and that it would be a bit tricky to be discussing an installation that none of you have yet experienced, though all 4 of us have spent varying amounts of time with the installation. So we thought we'd start with a little bit more descriptive section, where then one that somewhat reflects the structure of the installation itself. And so we decided that I would sort of act as your surrogate in a way, and I would provide a description. I'll try and be as descriptive as possible in this and basic in my description of the installation and my experience, initial experience of it. And then we would break it out into just sort of discrete parts. So we would, each one of them would talk about their own experience, their own component of the installation, which would allow us also to get to some questions of their own individual practice, the sense of place in their own individual components. And then we would sort of come back together to start talking about the origins of the piece, its conceptual underpinnings, and then into how it has evolved and is about to be, I guess, in a few moments when it goes live. So I will start with, again, the description, which was just from a couple of days ago when I first experienced or went into the installation itself. And I had a couple of notes from it, again, keeping it very descriptive. So already with the idea of metric displacement, you expect a little bit of disorientation as you go into something like this. And of course, Zoom, I always find Zoom disorienting. So entering into this installation, which is very much like entering into this talk for you, but instead of being presented with the faces of participants, you're presented with the 3 turntables in apparently different locations with map coordinates. You're in, and like I think in the real world, going into a sound installation in an unfamiliar gallery, you orient yourself and figure out how to listen, how to take it in, what is going on here. It's just a little difference in a Zoom room, in that kind of space, as you find your way to listen. And for each person, I suspect it'll be somewhat different. But I think one of the key things is to spend a good amount of time in there myself. And I had the benefit of being able to spend a good amount of time. So we have 3 turntables and playing 3 discrete lock grooves, you realize. And at first, and it's hard to even recreate after I returned to it, in a way the discrete elements are not that apparent. You hear a rhythmic pulsing tone, you hear crackle, you hear something that's almost more melodic and slowerly undulating tone. And then you sit with it for a while. Your brain tries to determine the patterns as things technically are repeating over and over again, and yet are changing over time. And for me, it was switching how I listened. Going away and coming back was very much the important part of it, as you tried to see how this was changing and acting. Even as I've talked to you in the room where I am, the sun just came out and it brightened and changed. You have that experience visually as you realize that you're in 3 different spaces, but really 4 spaces, because there's the space of the installation as well. And you start to wonder what the process is and how this has come together into one. So I guess we'll start now with getting some of these component parts, and we'll start by go in alphabetical order for this, first with Annie in Bern. So we'll start with Annie.
Hi, thank you so much.
Yeah, so could you talk a little bit about how you approached the process of creating the loops that you created here, and just how you entered into this collaboration?
So almost a year ago, I put together my instrument, which is a modular custom-made analog synthesizer, and based on its components, which constitutes a synthesizer, but still remains individual. I experimented and searched for sounds that I like, and I play them live. And yeah, and so I did my recordings and recorded these sounds and put them together. And yeah, like searching for these details, that crackling sounds, that was super interesting to me. that was my contribution to this project.
Should we go on? How did in terms of the crackling parts, I know part of it was around evoking a sense of place. Did you have that sort of in your mind's eye as you were creating the pieces?
Yes, yeah, the environment was crucial, of course, because also almost a year ago, we all went to lockdown, and that gave me another perspective of being alone as well. And I guess the focusing on details in my environment also brought me to focus on details in terms of my sounds, and that was very important and also very special to me to find some connections happening there.
Great. Should we move straight to Brian from here, and we'll just go through all three of you and then come back through? So Brian, how did you first approach and start with your contribution to the piece?
Yeah, I think we'll talk more about our process later, that this, this grew out of a collaborative process where we were sharing beats with each other online, and for me, most of my practice these days in general is research based, right? So I'm really interested in how to work with time scales that are beyond our typical range of perception. So yeah, things like rat communication, or I have a project now about glaciers, and also interested in infrasound. So these things are kind of beyond our ability to perceive directly, but for me, they're still about rhythm. And I think as an artist, it's important for me to have some kind of daily practice that's a little bit more concerned with formal aesthetics than it is conceptual, right? To be able to remember kind of in my body what rhythm means, and how I relate to sound and pulsation and meter, that then I can take to the other kind of conceptual aspects of my practice. And so, I think when it comes to rhythm, this process of making beats can totally, serve that purpose. And I'm not as prolific an electronic musician, as my collaborators here, but I am really fascinated with this idea of sequencers, and how you build an apparatus to organize time, with the intention of making a beat, whatever that is. So I've been engaged in this process of coding my own sequencers, MIDI sequencers, but making them in software that using Python. And since starting to exchange work with Annie and Marcel, the focus for me has really been on micro rhythms. So these kind of subtle differences in the position of a pulsation or a beat that gives a rhythm a different feel, right? And that's something that's obviously really an important part of Afrological music, but I think is maybe otherwise underexplored in a electronic music context. And the constraints of this piece are pretty extreme. I mean, the loops that we're making are only 1.8 seconds long, right? So it fits in a lock groove on a vinyl record at 33 1/3 RPM. So microrhythms for me were kind of a way to be expressive within that small constraint, by these kind of subtle movements of a beat, a little bit ahead, a little bit behind. And I'm sending those MIDI signals out to a couple, kind of off the shelf MIDI sequencers, or MIDI synthesizers, rather, drum machines. The Korg Volca that came out is great. And now I've been getting some older Jomox analog drum synthesizers on eBay, so that's been fun. But yeah, I think for me, ultimately, I'm attracted to this idea that the rhythms that we respond to, are not only about like our cultural context or our personal taste, but also kind of the way we physically move in the world. And so for me, maybe similar to what Annie was just saying, since there's such a focus on internal dynamics and, being in quarantine, and in this kind of constrained space, that had me turn towards this idea of microrhythms and these subtle changes, within such a rigid framework.
So I was having a little problem unmuting my audio. So there we get the constraints of technology, or the constraints of my hand. But why don't we turn straight to Marcel, and then we can sort of bring the three of you together into discussing. So Marcel, how did you end up at the beginning with this project and the collaboration? And Brian was mentioning that you guys were trading beats even before this project started. And maybe we could start with sort of the beginning of that collaboration, and then your contribution to this.
Yeah, thank you, Susanna. Annie and Brian already foreshadowed a lot, but for me, it's important that this project really comes out of a tradition of collaborating with my two collaborators here. I've had a tradition with Annie to collaborate to produce dance music together. I've had a tradition together with Brian to share bits of code and talk about our art. And so I think it was really almost thanks to the pandemic that the three of us came together so organically, because in last March, when the pandemic started, it all of a sudden felt very natural to meet on Zoom. And so I think we started doing these virtual studio visits weekly in the first part of the pandemic, and we carried that tradition on for a long time. And I think in this initial isolation, each of us, as Brian foreshadowed, each of us did feel a need to just go on producing at least something, if everything is canceled, to still like go on our own and make something. So that idea of the making, of the just keep going, I think was important for me personally to hold up during these times of lockdown. And so then the project grew naturally, also obviously with the help of Swissnex San Francisco and the production grant that enabled us to doing this project. But the ideas slowly and collaboratively developed. Now, for my part, what I contributed in sound is that my practice, similar and yet different perhaps to Brian's practice, also emerges around code, or this intersection between technology, code, rhythm, and also human beings like musicians who normally play with, alongside, or against these mechanical rhythms that I program. And so this very momentum of playing together with people, that is what obviously felt off, what was cut off at the beginning of the pandemic. So in my own practice, I felt the need of doing more performatively on my own in my home studio that really didn't exist and still doesn't exist. Like what I call a home studio is actually just one small synthesizer that I got shortly before the pandemic, one short analog Moog synthesizer. But it would be sort of obvious for me, for coming out of my practice, to just send software code or MIDI information into that synthesizer and play it from the computer. But then I felt that need of performing it on my own, and it's an instrument that really is not made for performance in the way that, sometimes you purchase a synthesizer and it comes with the built-in keyboard. It's sort of meant for the stage, but this one here is not. It's actually much closer to the practice or the instrument that Annie is building, this like very, very it's just a piece of gear. It doesn't come with any keyboard or so. So you have to make sense of it for you in order to activate it or to make something with it. So what I did, I also purchased a little a pad, a finger pad, and I actually did tons of research and practice on YouTube, where a lot of people offered their knowledge for free to other folks in the community about making beats by just playing beats by hand on a keyboard or on pads. And so these are mostly people from an African diasporic or Latinx communities of practice who make beats that belong to a very specific genre, perhaps, or style of practice or so. And so I learned, I trained myself in some of these knowledges, and I got better, but I'm still very poor at performing by hand. So I think one of the what came out of this project, and also what I put into this project as my part, really was the idea that we're working with mechanical loops, the idea of mechanical loops, but I always wanted to play these by hand. And so it's also about micro timing. It's about being irregular in a specific way, in a systemic way that deviates from machinic regularity, but different to what Annie is doing with her very organic temporal patterns that come out of this mechanical instrument, and also very different from Brian's micro time ideas that come out of conceptual and software ideas. And Brian and Annie, correct me if I'm wrong, but so I felt I have to add or contribute something that is different from the two of them, and so that's what I mostly did.
So within the as to sort of how the evolution went from the three of you exchanging beats and exchanging information, how did the idea of bringing Zoom into the equation, which I think also brings to some of the, what interesting is what the organic qualities of Zoom might be that add to this, because I think what's been interesting, and what when you're in, as in, experiencing it, going into it, you wonder what Zoom is bringing to it, but you're unsure. And I think that's interesting to like what the creative possibilities, we think about constraints with Zoom, but what the creative possibilities are with Zoom seem to be part of what is here, like both that it has a loss and it also has a plus with those loss, or constraints bring some new forms of creativity. So I was wondering if you could speak how that sort of, to get to the beginning of this specific project. And maybe if we wanted to start with Marcel, since you were just speaking, or if either of the two of you want to take that up.
I can jump in. I think, if you're playing beats for each other over, over Zoom, it's of course the question arises like, oh, we should, play these simultaneously. Can we synchronize them? And, the idea of musically collaborating over a network, I mean, that's something that people have been exploring for a long time and trying to figure out, with varying kind of degrees of success. But I think it's always been, approached, or is typically approached from the standpoint of a problem. We have latency and glitches and connection errors and, whatever else, sound quality, lag. But, when we're thinking really about like, okay, what are the material elements of these beats? Like Zoom becomes part of that. And so, okay, how could we use these temporal distortions in Zoom as actually part of what we're producing? So, I think there was a shift there, into this conceptual realm where we're kind of reflecting on, okay, what is this, beast that has been unleashed, this concept of constantly having this social interaction over Zoom, and all the temporal distortions that we endure. What would it mean to approach that as an aesthetic opportunity? So yeah, I think that's what it came out for me. Maybe the others have more to add to that.
Marcel, any thoughts in terms of I think that idea of the kind of what Brian is talking about is even that also the idea of displacement that's occurring here as well. And I wondered if maybe even we should address a little bit what about the nature of the title and displacement as a creative act. When Marcel first brought the idea of or mentioned the title to me, I remembered the first thing I thought of with metric displacement was the artist Thomas Brinkman, who was active in the 90s. There was a quote which I was trying to look for from him with a project that he did that happened to be with vinyl and with rhythms, that was talking about displacement as a creative act, and what he used as his main compositional tool was displacement. It was a twin arm turntable piece, which the right arm was the right channel, the left arm was left channel, and he was through specific coordinates on the vinyl then was creating new pieces out of a previous piece. But it's that idea of displacement, which is very different from this displacement in a lot of ways, but it still made me think of displacement as the core of his creative practice. So I was wondering if again, to think of this, what about metric displacement and the title, just to get that idea out there as well.
I thank you, Susanna. I think this is a great segue. Thinking about it, the nature of the title in relationship to the mediality of the piece. And in fact, I think I want to say that there are two questions of medium here, one being Zoom, the other being vinyl, that are quite different in their media history also. Like vinyl, the LP, is something that definitely is associated with high fidelity listening, which Zoom clearly is not, or perhaps not yet. So I think we could and we should go on there. But I first want to comment on the title, metric displacement. So metric as being this term that refers to measurement, something that can be or is measured, a tool for measurement, but also a sort of an international standard for measurement, which clearly is connected to the ideas of the empire, of colonialism, of territory expansion. In thinking it in music, however, obviously there is musical meter. There is an idea of synchronization which is detached from the idea of colonialization, which is the playing together in time, right? And sort of a tool or a system that enables several people to play together in time. And so there's that meter. But now what happens when we put that through Zoom and we displace that? And displacing again, I think is interesting here because it also displacement has a political component when human beings are being displaced, but it also has a technical component when it's just refers to something that is put into motion, or more like moved out of its original position. So displacement also always means that there was a position in the first place, like that an object has a location. And so now we're working here with three distinct locations across the world. We're making these beats which evolve from the exact same meter, which we defined in the first place. And then we displace them into the Zoom gallery room, which is at the same time everywhere, but also nowhere. It's just out there. And so the coming together, which should be a recreation of that 1 meter, clearly is not, because as Brian and you, Susanne, already said, it's going off. Like it's not in sync. It's clearly not in sync. It's not high fidelity. It's everything else. And then I think that's why this sort of very, very rich title came in or made sense for us. And this is also for us all now to start thinking about well, if there are so many losses and constraints, what then actually are the gains of such a project? Perhaps in terms of sound, of listening, but also of the experience or the concept more broadly.
I think that leads to maybe almost getting into actually what the experience or how this evolved, and how now that it's out, you know, we've had a little bit of conversation prior to this even of the surprises that are there. I want to do want to mention one thing, that for audience members out there, please do feel free to post your questions in the Q&A for the Q&A that will happen in a little bit. So any questions that come to mind, it's good to jot them down now, and we'll answer them in a little bit. So maybe to get to what that you know, kind of with thinking about loss, which is the kind of thing that you know, we tend to, what Brian was talking about earlier with the kind of things of the feeling of when tends to focus on almost the negative, the loss, the constraint of Zoom, and rather than not even the possibility, but how this has, as it's gone out into the world, or rather as it's gone out into the Zoom world, how have you seen this evolving? Like, could you describe how how is it played out? In what ways is it played out as you expected, and in what ways have you found this lack of sync, lack of you know, lack of you know, this part of how it is what has it yielded, I guess, is my short version of what my long question is.
I would like to add an advantage that I experienced during this process, working with Zooms, and also making experiences with displacements via Zoom and its technology. And I am very surprised if I think about interplay, the musical interplay, how it worked together in the end. And also, what I was also very surprised was the wear out of the vinyl. I didn't expect that. I have not much experience working with this kind of media, and the needle wears the vinyl out. So I'm so surprised that even this gives another musical it adds something new musically to the whole sound components that I'm very surprised of, and also super happy about it, I have to be honest. I don't know how you feel, Brian and Marcel, about that, but I have a very good feeling.
No, I think it's great. You know, the idea that, okay, you play a single lock groove for days on end, you know, it's going to transform it. And I mean, it does point to the contingencies of the materiality of this piece. And I think, well, yeah, I think Marcel spoke really eloquently about the title, but I think maybe one quibble or alternative interpretation I would have with it is the idea of Zoom as a non-space, because of course it tries to sell itself to us as that, right, as a transparent medium, you know, where we can interact freely, but in between us is, you know, our data centers and cables, and, you know, a massive use of electricity and a resulting kind of social inequity depending on who has access to what and who gets to be on Zoom and who can't be on Zoom. And, you know, it's not a neutral platform in any way, right? And there's also, you know, a question of agency, you know, that being on Zoom, we surrender a certain you know, capacity that we have in person in the same space. You know, we surrender it to the kind of hidden power of the technological infrastructure, to the tech companies that build it, and whatever political you know, agenda they have for it. So, you know, that can get dark really quickly, and especially when we talk about this moment of brokenness, you know, that we've been having as a society. But I think this piece, you know, we're not fixing any of that, certainly, but we are kind of meditating on it, and working with these rhythms that aren't seamless is part of that, right? You know, at least on the level of the interface. How do we actually embody that feeling? And I think my surprise is that it kind of works, or at least I found it satisfying, because it's one of these pieces that you can't actually hear until it's all assembled. You know, until we had the loops constructed and the 3 records cut in the different locations, you know, and put that all online. And this question of like, well, does it really sound different? You know, do the network dynamics, does this create a composition that's not any of our individual agencies and also something different than the sum of our agencies? You know, does something else come out of that? And hearing it and sitting with it for a while, I was like, oh, I think it does. I think there is something here. And I don't know what that is yet for me. I think I have to listen to it more. And I don't know if it's a pessimistic thing, or I'm hoping that it is a hopeful thing, you know, that there's something that it points to as a coping strategy, or some unanticipated, you know, beauty that might emerge from this situation in some way.
Thanks for bringing that up, Brian. I do feel some urgency now to just jump in and tell everyone what actually is on that record, or on these 3 records, just because, Brian, you said locked groove, and Annie, you said that these LPs are wearing down. And so I think it's important to know, because these are the things that are not just easily experienceable or visible in the exhibition, that what is on these records, these are not normal records, right? We all, the 3 of us, made beats, and so a lot of beats, and so we selected very tiny portions of these beats and cut these into vinyl as a locked groove. That means, like, when normally on a vinyl you have a spiral, you have like 45 minutes or 18 minutes on each side. Here, literally, we had them cut in a, you know, manually done lathe cut in rings. So there's always one ring containing one loop, and that's literally 1.8 seconds. That's the duration it takes for it to spin one round. And so these are very tiny units, and they loop forever. And this sort of practice, I think, goes against all our practices. Like, it's a start. They really stand in a very stark contrast to what we're doing otherwise, with microtemporal variation that takes on, you know, over long bits of time. And now we're working with these loops. And so the 3 records are identical. They're hand cut. They all contain the same 18 loops, 6 by Annie, 6 by Brian, 6 by myself. And in each location, every day or every couple hours, randomly a new loop will be chosen. So we get ever new combinations of Brian's, Annie's, and my loops. And because these records are hand cut, that means they're not industrial, they're not mass produced, they're not that good quality. And so that means they're degrading much faster, especially like in this exhibition here, we're playing them with real Pro Audio needles, cartridges that also are more degrading, or just exercise more attention toward the vinyl, the material. And so the material degradation is audible, becomes audible. That's part of it. So there's one, that's the vinyl. But then comes Zoom. And I think we did a little bit of comparing the non-Zoom plus Zoom, which was quite hard, honestly, because, and I think this is one of the specialties of our project again, like who has, like, which artist is working in the same medium as their collaboration is also happening. Like, so the conflation Zoom as our meeting medium, but also as the medium in which we're listening is quite special here. So now Zoom changes the rhythm and the timbre of these loops in a very specific way. And in fact, I have personally come to really like what Zoom does, how Zoom distorts. And I think it's rather beautiful. It's a pity that this sort of beauty that I'm referring to here doesn't quite work so well with voice, what Zoom is designed for in the first place. But with vinyl and our loops, I think it works quite magically. It works. And it's also it's ironic. It's funny in a way that who would ever listen to their vinyl collection through Zoom? Like who would why would you ever do that, right? And so I think these are things that we're gaining out of this project, sort of by accident, but somehow we also provoke these things, I guess.
It was interesting because it's with two formats that have, in the case of vinyl and Zoom, though I wouldn't have, I mean, well, I guess one does always think with Zoom of loss, as the case of vinyl, that it will degrade. The more you love it, the more you lose from it. That it's such an interest, and there's Zoom, perhaps that's not the case. Whether you love it or you hate it, it loses the same amount, I guess. But it's interesting that you would, I guess it's when you talked about using Zoom as a for its rhythmic properties. I'm trying to remember exactly how it's like. What have you found in terms of its effect on the rhythms, and also in as you've been living with it now out in Zoom, because I think Brian was saying up until very recently, you haven't really been able to hear the project as a whole, just sort of more in its discrete elements. How have you been finding, what are you finding out of that experiment, the rhythmic part of Zoom? Maybe Brian, have you had?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I need to be able to spend more time to sit with it. Yeah, but I think I think in the beginning I was worried, like, will these things shift often enough to be perceptible for someone who's coming into the installation for a short period of time? I mean, we have it up, it's 24/7 for the next 10 days, right? But I mean, someone is certainly welcome to sit there and listen to the whole thing ambiently if they would like, but it's more something like, oh, drop in and hear it for a second and pull out again. And I think I was struck actually about how much variation is produced in such a short time by the network connection and the contingencies of it. I think we notice it less when we are speaking one at a time and speaking over Zoom and in the meeting format that it's been designed for. But it certainly wasn't designed for playing 3 audio streams simultaneously, all of which are highly repetitive, and structured. So I think in doing that, we're highlighting a lot of the distortions and changes that are happening that we're not otherwise aware of when we're using Zoom. So that turned out, to me at least, to be surprisingly rich. And fair warning, it depends on your own internet connection also. So everyone who visits the installation will have a different experience. It will sound different. Things will be aligned differently, depending on how they're connected to each of the three streamers and how that works on the back end. I don't know how Zoom does that on the back end. So yeah, I think for me it was surprisingly rich in terms of how those rhythms do play off each other and how quickly they do change.
Yeah, I think Mary Ellen is going to be joining also for Q&A in just a second. And one thing I was going to say, I actually did live with it for quite a while when I first had it, and it almost became like a drone for me, which was not when I first was thinking. I find things out of over the, I encourage people, if they have the time or the inclination, as I said, one of the benefits for me of being the moderator was I had an excuse to do this for very long periods and drop in and drop out to sort of get a sense of what I thought was, what is my perception, my internet connection, the fact that you once your brain finds a pattern and locks onto it, it wants to find it over and over again, and I can't recapture the moment at the beginning where it didn't do that. It's very hard to get myself back to that point. And I'm like, am I now hearing it as a drone because of Zoom, because of my own connection, because of my own mental connections? But Mary Ellen, I'll let you come in and take over for a little bit. Thank you all for this.
Great, thank you everybody for the discussion. We have a couple of questions that have appeared here. We only have a few minutes now, actually, before we launch the installation for you all to join. But first, we have a question from Richard. What was for each of you, the three artists, the biggest or better, the most difficult, the biggest or most difficult challenge in this project due to the pandemic? Anyone? Anyone have a thought on that?
I think it's hard to answer in a way because the project is a result of the conditions of the pandemic, right? So it wouldn't exist without it. So of course it's difficult, but as the difficulty was inherent in it. I think maybe the material production, as it turns out, sending records, getting the records cut and sending them internationally. And, there's kind of a logistics around it. So engaging in displacement on that level, the fact that we were separated by thousands of miles, physically coordinating it turned out to be somewhat challenging.
Great, thanks. We have another question that is not asynchrony a legitimate form of synchrony, hence the acceptance and inclusion of the physical electronic space that you all have decided to work in?
I'm happy to take this one unless you, Annie, want it. I think something that I do feel obliged to say or urged to say is that if Zoom were perfect, and by perfect I mean temporally flat, high fidelity, our work wouldn't work. Like it would be quite boring a work, I think. Like we haven't had the chance to actually experience that because we're all on Zoom all the time. And I do feel, and obviously I'm exaggerating a tiny bit because there would also be something to 3 record players playing in one and the same physical space and sort of gradually running out of synchrony if you were to have them spinning at slightly different paces, but mediating them via Zoom. I think we're exactly playing with this idea of asynchrony, of this a sense of lack of synchrony, which has come to be a notion of all social interactions in the pandemic, that we're always waiting for someone to reconnect and all of that, and someone drops out, and so now we're doing that with record players. So I think when we're talking about synchrony, it's because we know that anyways, whatever is going to happen here is out of sync or is asynchronous. I don't know if Brian and Annie, if you wanted to add on to me.
I like the word acceptance in the question, because I suppose there is some element of that, or surrender. And understanding that these beats will line up in a certain way because they're the same length, but how they align in the rhythms that are produced, is out of our control in a little bit. So that there is a certain kind of surrender to that. which, just to relate to a question further down, does have something to do with free jazz, I think. Also, that maybe you move in and out of tempos and meters, and you don't necessarily know where someone else is going to go when playing. So there's a certain kind of surrender also present in free jazz. Yeah, and not to, I don't mean to call out the identity of the person who asked the question, but Alvin Curran's pieces, such as the Hope Street Tunnel Blues, was actually had an influence on this piece, or at least it's something that I was listening to in terms of the pulsation in that work for piano. Was something that I has been thinking about in writing the sequencer that I used for my segments of the loops. So I just wanted to thank Alvin for that.
Great. There's more questions than there is time left, but perhaps we'll jump on this one. It's a question about Zoom as a medium, is whether or not it's only an audiovisual component of the software, or are there other functions that are also components of the piece? I believe not, right? Is that true? I believe you've...
I can say something. Yes, I mean, totally. Zoom is, for us, is more than just using Zoom to stream. It really is also the place that Zoom is, that including everything, not including the chat. You will see once you enter that we have disactivated quite a few things, so there won't be any chat. There is no, an audience is not even allowed to unmute or turn their cameras on, but there is agency clearly to the audience. For instance, you can switch between gallery view or a speaker view, in which case you will always end up seeing the loudest record player. So there are things you can do to it, with it. So you can play around within the constraints of Zoom. You can enter from Zoom on a mobile device outdoors, or you can use a larger computer screen. You can use better speakers or just laptop speakers. So there's a lot that comes with the decision to use Zoom as an art gallery, or a sound art gallery, or a listening space.
Thank you, Marcel. I think we need to shift now away from the questions. Thank you all to the audience for your questions. We're approaching the launch soon. I just wanted to invite everyone to a concert, Metric Displacement concert, which will be on April 2nd and is organized by Gray Area. I think it'll be interesting to see what the difference is between the installation and a concert. So I'm looking forward to that. You can find the link to that event both on the Gray Area website and the Swissnex website. I also want to just let you know, everyone, our audience, that we'll be joined again by this group at the end of May. We're going to have a festival here at Swissnex where we bring in all of the Artist Call projects and meet and discuss 8 different projects together. And Marcel, Annie, and Brian will join us again. Please keep your eyes peeled for that announcement on the website. We need to go to the launch now, everyone. Any last words? I think Marcel has to jump out quickly and get the installation started. We'll share the link to the installation in the chat. But just so you know, the minute you click it, you're out of here. So thank you for joining us today. Any last thoughts?
I have one last thought, just because this is sort of, it feels like the last opportunity to tell you something about the work. So there's a time zone difference, a daylight difference. And those of you in San Francisco right now will see that Annie is in a place where it's night. So I just want to say there is an incentive to check back or tune into the installation again and again at very different times of the day. And you will also experience different versions of the installations. So thank you everyone so much here for having us. As Mary-Ellen said, I'm jumping off to get the installation ready.
Okay, great. Any last words from anyone else? Otherwise, I'm going to suggest everyone jump on the installation.
I think except for to second what Marcel said, that I think the longer you spend, I think that's part of what's really interesting. I didn't discuss so much the visual element, but that's also some of the patterns that you get to seek through this. So
Great.
I think that's.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Susanna, Brian, Marcel, Annie. Everyone have a great evening or day wherever you're at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary-Ellen
Thank you.
and Susanna.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all.